So now we'll close this speaker round with Andrei Cimpian, who earned a PhD in psychology from Stanford University in 2008 and is now professor of psychology at the New York University. His research investigates motivation and academic achievement with a particular focus on how educational outcomes are shaped by gender and racial or ethnic stereotypes. His research has been published in many top journals such as Science, Science Advances, Psychological Science, and they earned him the 2018 American Psychological Association Distinguished Scientific Award for Early Career Contribution to Psychology. Media outlets also such as the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, or The Economist have covered his work, which he will tell us about today, which here focus on the developmental roots of gender gaps in science and engineering. So please welcome Andrei.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to present, and thank you to all of you for being here. I am excited to tell you today about some of the work that my collaborators and I have done, trying to explain the gender imbalances that are still so prevalent in many branches of science and engineering by looking at development. And now, one thought you might have right away is, well, that's sort of strange. People become scientists when they're adults. Why do you look at kids? What do young kids have to do with this problem? And that's a reasonable thought to have. And the reason why I look at development is pretty simple. If you look at a pipeline analysis, for example, of when you observe gender gaps in STEM, you essentially see that the gender gaps that you see at the university level and the PhD level actually are already in place at high school. If you ask high school students, male and female students, what they want to major in when they go to university, you see gender gaps that are about the same magnitude as you see among university degrees. So the answer here to why we should look at development is that the gaps that we see in many branches of science and engineering are meaningfully informed by processes that are happening early in development, such that by the time kids are 15 or 16, we already see women and men, young women and men, diverging in their career aspirations. Okay, so how might we understand the developmental factors that undermine girls' pursuit of STEM? Here's a simple and maybe oversimplified theoretical model that we could use to understand these aspirations. We know from a lot of research over the last 5 or 6 decades in the psychology of motivation that motivation to pursue an activity or a career is in large part a function of 2 variables. One is how confident we are in our abilities to succeed in that line of work. And the second one is how interesting or otherwise valuable we perceive that line of work to be. This is the expectancy value, Jackie Eccles and others, if you're familiar with this research. So the idea is that the higher the interest in something, the higher the motivation to pursue that something, and the higher the confidence in your ability to succeed, the higher the motivation to pursue that something. Oops. Okay, let's go back. Okay, but let's drill a little deeper here. So what drives confidence? What drives interest? A fruitful way of analyzing these constructs and the influences on them looks to broader societal stereotypes about, particularly in STEM, how people see people in STEM and how people see women and men, boys and girls. So we know that we have a lot of baggage that society attaches to our particular social identities. These are stereotypes about girls and women. And there's also a lot of baggage that society attaches to being a member of a particular discipline or a particular field. When the way the society perceives us is aligned with the way that society perceives people of a particular discipline, when there's a match, then that induces a boost in our confidence and our interest in our ability to perceive that, and therefore to pursue that field, and therefore in our motivation to pursue that field. However, and this is the case for girls and women in science, unfortunately, the way we perceive girls and women and their attributes and their behaviors is largely inconsistent with how we perceive scientists on a number of dimensions that I'll give you some examples of, right? So when there's a mismatch with respect to how society perceives people in the field and how society perceives people of a particular social identity, that'll undermine our confidence and our interest, and therefore motivation to pursue that. So for example, here's a couple of dimensions that are relevant here. This is work by Amanda Diekman and colleagues, and it suggested that there's significant misalignment between how we perceive scientists and how we perceive girls and women with respect to the dimension of altruism and communality. The general public's idea of a scientist is that of someone, often a man, who works by himself to satisfy his own curiosity about how the world works, and maybe to make a name for himself and win a Nobel Prize or something. These stereotypes about scientists are quite different from stereotypes that we have about girls and women who are typically socialized to want to help others and want to be around and work with others, so communally oriented. And this mismatch then is likely to take a toll on girls' confidence in their abilities and interest in STEM careers, and therefore in their motivation to pursue STEM. Today I'm not going to talk about this particular dimension of mismatch, but rather this dimension of mismatch that pertains to intellectual ability. So what I'll tell you about today pertains to the idea that we often view as a society scientists as being particularly intellectually gifted, as having exceptional intellectual abilities. And unfortunately, the general public also associates these qualities with men more than women. Right? These ideas are already present in children's environments and are actually absorbed by children, which means that from a young age, we're going to see young girls' aspirations to pursue a career in STEM being hampered because their confidence and their ability to pursue STEM and their interest in these careers are undermined by the mismatch between how we perceive scientists as a society and how we perceive girls and women. So this is what I'm going to try to convince you of today. This is the sort of the hypothesis that I'm starting with. The relevance of these stereotypes was highlighted to me by a study that we did some years ago, where we asked members of various academic fields across 30 different fields what they believe is required for success in their field. And then we looked at whether their beliefs about what's required for success, and in particular whether high-level intellectual ability is required for success in their field, whether that predicts the extent of the gender gaps that you observe in those fields. And what we found is that, in fact, it does. When you look across the 30 fields in this survey of US academics, you see that the more a field emphasizes brilliance, or intellectual ability, exceptional intellectual ability as the key to success, the fewer women in the US obtain PhDs in that field. And this actually applies even when you just look at STEM fields. When we had 12 STEM fields in our sample here, when you subset the fields to just those that focus on science and technology and engineering and math, you see that the more a STEM field value brilliance, the fewer women obtain PhDs in that field. And this evidence it's important because it implicates these stereotypes about who's brilliant and who's not in the gender gaps that you observe. So if the idea here is that because women are perceived as being less intellectually capable than men are, in fields where intellectual ability is prized as the key to success, women are going to have more difficulties for a number of reasons pursuing these fields for in the long term. And that can happen for any number of reasons. One can be bias on the part of people already in those fields who might not perceive their female students and colleagues as being sufficiently intellectually gifted. And for the reasons that I'm going to talk about today, which is that the mismatch between perceptions of these fields and what women perceive society to think of them induces a lower interest and confidence in their ability to pursue these fields. Okay, so up to this point, you've had to take it on faith that such stereotypes exist that impugn the intellectual abilities of women more so than men. Let's talk about some evidence. Is there actually evidence that these stereotypes are present in modern day society? We often like to think that we're past stereotypes, that, like we've solved gender and we're a gender egalitarian society, whether it's the US or France. But I'm sure many of you won't be surprised by the fact that we haven't. So here's a bit of evidence that we haven't. Here's an article from a few years ago where the author had access to anonymous Google searches performed by American parents in the privacy of their homes. He was interested in what parents searched Google with respect to their sons and their daughters, and in particular, how often the parents search Google with respect to their sons' intellectual attributes versus physical attributes, and the same for daughters. So what are parents more interested in, more concerned about, more likely to expect of their sons and their daughters? What the author found is that for every 10 searches that American parents performed about their daughters being gifted, there are 25 searches about boys being gifted. So parents were 2.5 times as likely to ask the internet whether their son is gifted rather than their daughter is gifted. And it's important to note here, this parenthetical here is, I included it on purpose. This is not a veridical, truthful perception. It's not that parents are interacting with their kids and perceiving their boys to be smarter. When you look at the composition of gifted and talent programs, for example, in the US, you see that girls are actually overrepresented relative to boys in these programs. So this is an expectation, a stereotype-induced, top-down expectation that parents bring to the table in their interactions with their sons and daughters. Sadly, you see the opposite pattern when you look at searches about physical attributes. So these searches are more common in Google searches about daughters than about sons. So for example, for every 10 searches about sons being overweight, there are 17 searches about daughters being overweight. Even for terms like ugly. So there were, is my daughter ugly was 160% times, percent as common as is my son ugly. And it's also interesting to think what parents expect the internet to tell them when they ask it whether their daughter is ugly. But these are things that American parents think is a good idea to ask the internet in the privacy of their homes. And I think it provides a particularly sort of unvarnished view of what people think, of what parents think, because none of them probably thought that at some point a researcher down the line is going to analyze the content of their searches and present statistics like this, right? So this is not a study that they're participating in. They don't think anyone's watching. And this is the kind of stuff that comes out of their computers, their heads. Okay, so these are parents, right? Can kids actually pick up on these ideas? And this is where some of our research comes in. So I'll go on to tell you about some studies that we've done in which we've investigated the acquisition of stereotypes that associate being brilliant with being a man more so than a woman. We started, this is work that was spearheaded by my former student, Lynn Beyond. We started with kids in the age range of 5 to 7 because that's an age range where many intellectually relevant gender stereotypes develop, for example, about math and reading. But it's also a fairly difficult age range to study because there's a lot of in-group bias at this age. Boys think that boys are better than girls at everything, and girls think that girls are better than boys at everything. So there's a lot of in-group pride and in-group bias, such that if kids catch on to the fact that you're interested in boys versus girls and gender, they're going to give you the answer that makes their gender look good rather than the answer that they think is truthful. So we needed to be a little sneaky and ask them about gender without really asking about gender. So here's how we did that. We used a number of tasks that had similar characteristics. I'm going to give you an example of one of them. One researcher talked one-on-one with a child and read a story that went something like this. There are lots of people at the place where I work, but there's one person who's really, really special. This person's really, really smart. This person figures out how to do things quickly and comes up with answers much faster and better than anyone else. This person's really, really smart, right? So a couple of interesting features of this story. One is that we're using really, really smart as opposed to brilliant or genius, which we have to do because these are young kids, so they're not going to understand us when we start talking about brilliant or genius. The other more important feature is that we don't mention gender at all. So we're talking about this person, this, and this person, that. There's no cue as to the gender of the person. So the idea here is that we want to catch kids in the act of imagining a particular individual. And we want to assess the gender of the individual that they imagine. So what we do after we read them stories like this is we just present them with a bunch of pictures of unfamiliar women and men, and we ask them to choose which one the person in the story was. Kids have no problem pointing to a person and saying, this is the person in the story. All of you might feel a little weird doing that, like, how am I supposed to know? But kids have no such issues. So what we did is just kept track of how often they chose members of their own gender as being really, really smart. And here's what we found. So I'm going to show you the data for 5, 6, and 7. Here's the proportion of own gender targets among the pictures that we showed kids that were chosen as really, really smart. At the age of 5, we only saw in-group bias, so both boys and girls chose members of their own gender about 70% of the time. However, at the age of 6 and 7, you see a difference emerging such that girls are much less likely, the younger girls, to choose members of their own gender as being really, really smart. And a girl's proportion of choosing their own gender dips significantly below that of boys. So one way of interpreting these data is that at the age of 6, you see the origin of the stereotype that associates exceptional intellectual ability with men more than women. A more skeptical perspective is that maybe girls are just more likely to get rid of their in-group bias. Maybe at the age of 6 or 7, girls are more fair and boys are still in kind of like la-la land of like, my group is better than the other group. That's not the case. We also measured another stereotype about who's really, really nice. And what you see here when you put these side by side, so these are the data for who's really, really smart, and these are the data for who's really, really nice. Girls have no trouble choosing girls as being the ones who are really, really nice. So it's not the fact that what's happening here with girls is that they're just becoming more fair, more realistic, but rather this is best interpreted as the beginning of the stereotype that associates men with intellectual ability, the stereotype that we saw, for example, in American parents in terms of what they Googled in the privacy of their homes. I'm not going to focus on this too much, but this is also sort of an incredibly sad data point. Being nice is something that we all want for ourselves and for those around us. And already at the age of 6, boys are giving up that very important attribute to the dreaded gender outgroup, right? So these 6-year-old boys are saying that girls are the ones who are really, really nice more often. And this is actually, as far as I'm concerned, this is the beginning of what we see now among men who are uncomfortable being caregivers. They're uncomfortable, being early childhood educators, being nurses, because of the stereotypes that we, as a society, induce in them at a fairly young age. So I'm not going to talk about this too much after this, but this is an important data point as well. This study was nice that I showed you, but it was on a fairly small sample of kids from a very particular region of the US, which is not the most progressive in terms of its politics. Urbana-Champaign, Illinois, for anyone who's familiar. When I moved from University of Illinois to New York University, I moved into a very sort of different cultural environment where the demographics of the people around me were very different. So we had the opportunity to replicate this study in a different cultural and demographic part of the US. But we saw very similar patterns. So we only had 5 and 6-year-olds in this study. I put the Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, and the New York data side by side. What you see is an overall very similar pattern whereby there's no difference in terms of girls and boys selections of members of their own gender at the age of 5, with a divergence that you see among the Champaign-Urbana, Illinois kids at the age of 6. So of course now it's 2 data points as opposed to 1, so not a strong basis to generalize from to kids in the US. I'll show you even more data that actually this sort of applies not just to the US, but across the globe. But still, because these are so different from each other culturally and demographically, it provides a fairly solid base for generalization. Okay, so one question that you're probably all wondering is what is happening at the age of 6? Why 6? In diverse locations, you're seeing these differences emerge at the age of 6. I wish we were also cognizant of that question as we designed the study. We weren't, because probably what you're thinking is, well, that's first grade. That's when kids in the US first start entering school and they get exposed to society's ideas about probably women and men and who's really, really smart. We didn't, in the original study, actually record kids' grade. But when we started thinking along these lines and trying to understand what's happening at the age of 6, we tried to go back and recontact as many of the kids as we could. We only got to about a third of them. But that was enough for kind of like a tentative exploration of whether it is something about being in first grade that induces, and we can't use the causal language here, that correlates more precisely with the arrival of these stereotypes. So I'm going to show you these data really briefly. I'm going to simplify how I present them. This is a difference between girls and boys in terms of choosing their own gender as really smart. So any numbers that are above 0 show a girl advantage, like a stereotype favoring girls. Any numbers below 0 show a stereotype favoring boys. And I'm going to split the data into before first grade and after, since first grade is the point that we think makes a difference. If you want to come along with me for this ride of, is it first grade? When you split the data this way, this is in fact what you see. So before first grade, there's nothing happening. There's no difference in terms of who's associated with intellectual ability. Whereas first grade and after, you see the stereotype that associates boys more than girls with, men more than women with intellectual ability. However, we haven't adjusted for age here. So this could be grade that's doing the trick, or it could be something having to do with maturation or some other aspect of development that co-occurs with age. When we adjust for age in a regression analysis and we plot the marginal means from that regression, we actually see the same thing. So this, even though it's not super strong evidence because we were only able to recontact about a third of the sample, this nevertheless suggests that there is something happening in first grade that even when you control for age, which is a very strong control because age is obviously very tightly correlated with a grade, you see that there's something happening in first grade that is inducing, again, if I may use this causal language, stereotypes in kids. Another bit of evidence for first grade being the culprit here is that if you look in countries where first grade is at a different age, not every country starts grade at the age of 6, some start at 7, you see that the stereotype emerges at that age that corresponds to first grade in those countries. So this is work by my former student Lynn Bian, who now has her own laboratory and collaborated with a couple of South Korean collaborators on this project. You see that in South Korea, where first grade is at the age of 7, you see the stereotype emerging at the age of 7. Again, this is circumstantial evidence, but nevertheless it points to first grade being an important turning point in terms of kids thinking about gender and intellectual ability. By the way, both our lab and others have found this idea that associates intellectual ability with men more than women in many other places around the world. We have evidence using an implicit association test from Singapore. Your Parisian colleagues, Clotilde Knapp and Thomas Breda from Dauphine and from Paris School of Economics have used PISA data, used a couple of items on the PISA data set to approximate these stereotypes, and have found them pretty much in every country in the PISA data set. So definitely not even just a Western thing, but fairly global phenomenon. Okay, so first grade, maybe, but why? What's happening in first grade? We wanted to dig a little bit deeper, and one thing that happens in first grade is that you start spending a lot of time in school and you start getting grades and you start getting assessed on how you're doing in school. So we thought maybe what kids are doing is looking around at who's doing well in school and using that information to base their inferences about who's really, really smart. In a way, that would be a rational thing, because what else are you going to use if not who does well in school? On the other hand, it would be a weird thing because in the US, and I'm sure in France as well, girls do better than boys at school from first grade all the way through 12th grade. So they would have to have a mistaken belief about who's good at school in order to infer the stereotype that we documented from that belief. But it wouldn't be the first time that kids believed something weird about the world, right? So we wanted to investigate this. So we essentially used a very similar paradigm here, where instead of asking them who's really, really smart or really, really nice, we asked them who is first in their class, who gets the best grades in their school. And what we see is something very different. When you plot the proportion of own gender choices, you see that girls at 5, 6, and 7 choose girls as being the ones who do best in school at 80 to 90% of the time. Right? And let me put these two side by side to kind of dramatize the difference. Here, girls' responses to who's really, really smart. Here, girls' responses to who is really good at school, right? For the kids that we have both data points from, there was as close to 0 a relationship as you can imagine between these two. So this is really puzzling. How can both of these things reside in one person's head? How can you both think that girls are better than boys at school and think that girls are not quite as smart as boys? One way to make sense of this, and this is something that we're actively exploring in my lab right now, is essentially maybe what is happening. This is what adults think, and I suspect that kids think the same thing. kids are thinking that the academic successes of girls and boys are driven by different factors. Girls succeed not because they're particularly gifted or talented or anything like that, but because they work hard. Whereas boys, when they succeed because of their intellectual talents. So if you think of school as something that you succeed because you worked hard, then girls maybe do well in school, but that's not because there's anything special about their intellectual abilities, but rather just they listen to the teacher, they do their homework, right? Whereas boys don't do as well in school, despite the fact that they're intellectually talented, they just don't try hard enough, right? So stay tuned for whether that turns out to be the explanation for this kind of like paradoxical association of beliefs here. Okay. Another possibility here that has to do with exposure to school, this is a paper that we published recently. We documented, this is high school, so I'm kind of extrapolating for that. We documented that in high school biology textbooks, sex and gender are portrayed in ways that are much more consistent with essentialism, which is essentially thinking that women and men are cats and dogs, women are from Venus, men are from Mars, than biological science would actually indicate. And this is not teaching them stereotypes per se, but inducing this kind of essentialist way of thinking about gender is nevertheless putting kids on the lookout for stereotypes, for what differentiates girls and boys, men and women, and therefore making it easy for them to acquire some of these stereotypes. I am running out of time, so let me just skip to, well, actually, I'm going to tell you about these data because these are important data. It's important to point out that these stereotypes are not just inert beliefs that kids have in their heads. That if you give them a novel activity, something that they've never seen before, you need to describe it as being either for kids who are really, really smart or for kids who try really, really hard. That induces a difference in terms of how girls and boys relate to those activities, such that girls' motivation, interest more specifically, to engage with that novel activity, something they've never seen before, is undermined by messages that this is a game for kids who are really, really smart. Whereas the same games, when a kid is randomly assigned, to hear that this is a game for kids who try really, really hard, show no difference in terms of girls' and boys' interest in them, right? So, and of course, what I'm interested in here is not these unfamiliar games, but rather when kids get a sense of the fact that math and science are for kids who are really, really smart, we definitely don't want this to be happening, right? But this is my way of kind of like bringing into the lab ideas about math and science, which we know from a young age kids already associate with being really, really smart. Very briefly, what we can do in light of this is first make sure that when we talk to young kids about things like math and science and what's required for success, we avoid using words like and portraying these fields as being for people who are brilliant and geniuses, but rather portray them as for what they are, which is skills. Science is a skill that you can acquire like any other skill. And to the extent that we can do that, I think we can improve the success of a range of kids of various social identities. If we want to combat stereotypes, I think we have to be very careful with our language. If you try to say things like girls is just as good at boys at science, that sounds good on the surface, but actually it's undermining because girls are taken as are being compared to the reference point that is boys. So actually in studies that have looked at this, that's shown to reinforce the idea that girls are not quite as good, whereas something like girls and boys are equally good at math and science is a much better way of saying the same thing. So if you want to combat stereotypes, the devil's in the details. Exposure to role models is important, but again, you have to make sure that the role model is conveyed in a way that will be motivating rather than demotivating, which role models can sometimes do. If the role model's success is seen as unattainable, then kids might actually be demotivated rather than motivated. So if you want some recommendations for what to do, we summarize some here, and I'm going to stop here and thank you for your attention.